Thank you very much, Francois, and thanks, Julio, for inviting me. I just spent 3 very pleasant weeks at IRMAX, the networking group at Simon Fraser University, working with Sandy Rutherford and colleagues. And if anybody really wants to know about networks, I would strongly advise you to go and talk to Sandy and his group. What I'm going to talk about is a rather simplified version compared to what they do of networks, and I'm going to look at some of the data on Vietnam and work that I did with Masai Keita, Ruben Granage, and many colleagues from Vietnam, and about which you've already heard rather good presentations yesterday. Just to remind you, for the non-epidemiologists amongst us, the most important concept in the whole of epidemiology is the case reproduction number. It's just the number of secondary cases that arise from one primary case in a completely susceptible population. And the point is simply that if R0 is greater than 1, the epidemic will spread. You infect more than one person. If its R0 is less than 1, the epidemic declines. You infect, on average, less than one other person. So that's really what I'm going to talk to you about. And what I want to present to you is a slightly novel way of thinking about and interpreting this case reproduction number. As I think you've already seen, the epidemic in Vietnam is quite complicated. It's a generalized epidemic. We have, in the middle of the graph, intravenous drug users. Top left, bottom left, we have female sex workers. Top right, we have men who have sex with men. Some MSM also inject drugs. Some female sex workers also inject drugs. The female sex workers, the bottom middle, have male clients. And of course, all of the men in each of these groups, some of them have female partners who we refer to here as low-risk women. So what we really want to know is how does the epidemic spread on this network, and how can we control it? What really impressed me about Vietnam is the quality of the data they have. I've never seen data quite as good as this for any concentrated epidemic in the world. And what is interesting is that they have data on the trends in the prevalence of HIV infection in all of these 5 important groups: IDUs, female sex workers, clients, MSM, and these low-risk women. And what you see immediately is various things. You see that the epidemic in the intravenous drug users started later than in the other groups, but went up much more quickly, and that turns out to be very important. We also see that the prevalence in the intravenous drug users, top left, is about 45%, going all the way down to the low-risk women, where it's only 0.4%. So the prevalence in intravenous drug users is about 100 times that in the low-risk women. But if you look at the top left, you see the number of IDUs is only in Can Tho province, about 3,000, while the number of low-risk women is 450,000. So there are 100 times more low-risk women than there are intravenous drug users, so that although the prevalence is 100 times lower, there are actually more low-risk women infected with HIV than there are intravenous drug users. So it's a very interesting and somewhat complex epidemic. It turns out that in order to fit the data, the only way you can get that reasonable fit, given the late, fast rise in intravenous drug users, is if we assume that the epidemic started in the female sex workers and was then only introduced from that group into the intravenous drug using group. So the model already tells us something about the dynamics of what's actually happening on the ground. So if we just look at the epidemic as a whole and we calculate the case reproduction number for the whole epidemic in the usual way, we see that the case reproduction number is about 22, which means we need to reduce transmission by about 22 times in order to eliminate HIV. Generalized epidemics in Africa, R0 is generally about 5, so the problem here appears to be about 4 times worse or more difficult to control than it is in Africa. But we can do better than that. We can look not just at the case reproduction number for the whole network, we can break it down into its component parts. We can look at the case reproduction number for each subcomponent of the network. So if you look at IDUs in the middle, you see the R0 for the IDUs is about 19, and that's really what's driving the epidemic. For the loop on the bottom left, female sex workers and their male clients, it's only about 2.1. So among the female sex workers and the male clients, we only need to halve transmission to take care of that. The MSM epidemic is also relatively marginal compared to the IDUs, with a case reproduction number of 2.2. But we can go one step further. Here I'm looking at the loops of transmission within each group or between pairs of groups. We can actually look at the transmission between people within each group. So we see that the female sex workers, on each female sex worker, bottom left, on average will infect 77 clients, each in the course of her life with HIV. Each client will 100 clients will only infect 6 female sex workers. And of course, the point is simply that sex workers are having sex with lots of different clients, clients are having sex with relatively few sex workers. But that tells us that if we really want to control the epidemic in the female sex, in the loop between the sex workers and their clients, we really need to make sure that the female sex workers are less infectious. And of course, this is probably one reason why the 100% condom campaign in Thailand was so effective, because they were targeting the female sex workers who within that loop are really driving the epidemic. Now, this tells us lots of other things as well. It mainly tells us that the intravenous drug users are the key to the epidemic. If we don't solve the epidemic in the intravenous drug users, we're not going to be able to solve it anyway. So the point of doing this kind of analysis is simply to guide us in our thinking so that we can think more clearly about how to explore the implications of control. So if we just run that model, the model you saw in the first slide with the data on it, then without treatment, without behavior change, this is what the future of the epidemic in Kanto province would likely to be. So prevalence stabilizing at 45% in IDUs, about top right, about 5%, 0.5% in low-risk women, and all the other groups somewhere in between. So we can say to ourselves, what would happen if we just control the epidemic in the intravenous drug users? And of course, the good thing, the thing which gives us hope for intravenous drug users, we can put them on treatment, but we can also do needle exchange. So it's a group for whom we have a very good prevention as well as very good treatment options. So we can imagine we do both needle exchange programs in the IDUs and treatment as prevention. So we control the epidemic in the IDUs. So the blue line top left is the prevalence, red is incidence, black is mortality, the purple line is actually ART coverage, which I didn't mean to put on the slide. But you see, we can drop the prevalence, the incidence, the mortality by 2018 or so. But the point of the slide is really not so much to look at the IDUs, but to see what is the effect on the other groups. And we see that even if we stop transmission in the IDUs, it has a big impact on female sex workers, low-risk women, MSM, and male clients. But in none of those groups does it go to zero, because those other epidemics are self-sustaining in themselves. So treating just the intravenous drug users would have a very dramatic impact on the other groups, very important, relatively easy to do. There are not so many of them, and they're relatively easy to find, but would not be sufficient to eliminate transmission in any of the other groups. What happened if we just treated the female sex workers? Well, that has almost no impact on the intravenous drug users, but of course has some impact on the male clients, the bottom middle, and a lesser impact on their female partners. And the reason why we don't eliminate the epidemic in the female sex workers is simply because some of them are still injecting drugs, and the female sex workers are injecting drugs that then maintain the epidemic in the female sex worker population, even if all female sex workers are constantly being treated. What if we treat the MSM? Well, if all the MSM are on ART, of course there's a big impact on the MSM. Again, it doesn't go to zero, so the blue and the red lines don't go to zero, because some of the MSM are still using drugs, so they're getting infected. Dealing with all the MSM transmission, but not really dealing with the IDU transmission. And of course, that has almost no impact on the IDU's female sex workers or the other groups. What happens if we treat the clients of the female sex workers? So that has a small impact on the female sex workers because the transmission is mainly from the sex workers to the men rather than the other way around. It consequently has a small effect on the low-risk women, but again, not on any of the other groups. Now, all of this is just a very approximate and sketchy, but to show you that what is important is, especially for concentrated epidemics, we need to think not only about the overall scale of the problem, but how we're going to address the problem in each of the groups, what the impact on each of those groups is going to be, and how the impact on one group affects the impact on other groups. So, sorry, I forgot to mention the low-risk women. Of course, since we assume they're an epidemiological dead end, we can put all of those we find positive, we can put them on ART, brings down the rate dramatically, but again, doesn't solve the problem completely, even for them, because they are still getting infected by male partners. So all of this is just to show you what I hope is an interesting and somewhat novel way of thinking about how to break down and understand the epidemic. And the point then is simply that in structured networks like this, which are quite unlike the generalized epidemics, we can go along the usual concept of R0. We still need to be able to project the impact of the intervention in the future, but this gives us a much more efficient way of deciding how to do that. So then if I can leave you just with a reminder, the point of models is not to provide the answers. It's rather to help us to think clearly and strategically about how to ask the right questions, and hopefully we might then find some of the answers. Thank you.